What do you do when your enemy's armor is so thick that your shells bounce off like pebbles against a fortress wall? When every engagement means watching your friends burn alive in their tanks while the enemy rolls forward, seemingly invincible? By 1945, American tankers in Europe faced exactly this nightmare. The German Tiger and Panther tanks weren't just machines. They were mobile fortresses that had turned the Western Front into a graveyard for American Shermans. But then something changed. Something arrived that would make even the most hardened SS Panzer commander think twice before engaging. Today, we're diving into the story of the M26 Pershing, the tank that was supposed to be too late, too heavy, and too experimental. The tank that military bureaucrats didn't want. The tank that, when it finally reached the battlefield, proved that American engineering could not only match German armor, but prevrated it into blazing scrap metal in seconds. This is the story of how desperation, innovation, and the blood of countless tankers finally forced America to build the war machine it should have had from the beginning. This is the story of the Pershing. March 1945, Cologne, Germany. The war in Europe was entering its final brutal chapter. Sergeant Earley and his crew sat inside their M4 Sherman, rolling through rubble-strewn streets, when they spotted it, a German Panther tank positioned at an intersection. The Sherman's 75mm gun was virtually useless against the Panther's frontal armor from this distance. Earley knew it. Every American tanker knew it. The kill-to-loss ratio between Shermans and Panthers told the story in blood. It often took 5 Shermans to destroy one Panther, and 4 of those Shermans wouldn't be going home. But Earley wasn't in a Sherman that day. He was commanding something new, something that had only arrived in Europe weeks earlier. He was in Pershing number 3 of the first 20 sent to combat. When he gave the order to fire, the 90mm gun roared, and the Panther erupted in flames with a single shot. The M26 Pershing represented more than just a technological advancement. It was an admission of failure, a correction of years of strategic miscalculation that had cost thousands of American lives. Named after General John J. Pershing, commander of American forces in World War I, this 46-ton beast carried the weight of expectation along with its armor plating. It mounted a 90mm M3 gun capable of penetrating 140 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. Its own frontal armor measured 102 millimeters thick, not impenetrable, but substantially better than the Sherman's pitiful 51 millimeters. The question that haunted American Armor Command wasn't why the Pershing arrived in March 1945. The question was why it hadn't arrived in June 1944. The story of the Pershing begins not with its creation, but with a catastrophic failure of imagination. In the years leading up to America's entry into World War II, military planners operated under a doctrine that would prove deadly. Tanks were for exploitation and infantry support, not for fighting other tanks. That job belonged to tank destroyers. This fundamental misunderstanding of armored warfare would haunt the battlefields of Europe. When American forces first encountered German armor in North Africa, the inadequacy of this doctrine became immediately, horrifically clear. The M3 Lee was a towering target with a sponson-mounted gun. The early M4 Sherman, while reliable and producible in vast numbers, was already outgunned by German designs. But here's where the tragedy deepens. American ordnance officers knew about German tank development. They had intelligence. They understood that heavier, more powerful German tanks were in development, and they chose to do nothing. The T-26 project, what would eventually become the Pershing, actually began in early 1943. Think about that date. American forces hadn't even landed in Italy yet, much less France. There was time, there was opportunity, but the Army ground forces, led by General Leslie McNair, actively opposed heavy tank development. McNair believed heavy tanks were too slow, too expensive, and unnecessary. He believed in the tank destroyer doctrine with almost religious fervor. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, German engineers were refining the Panther and Tiger designs. They were creating monsters. The Panther, with its sloped 80mm frontal armor and long 75mm KWK-42 gun, could kill a Sherman from 2,000 meters while remaining virtually immune to return fire. The Tiger, with its 80mm gun and 100mm frontal armor, was even worse. American tankers called combat against these machines murder. The T-26 development proceeded in fits and starts, hampered by changing requirements, inter-service rivalry, and bureaucratic inertia. Initial prototypes were too heavy. The engine wasn't powerful enough. The transmission failed repeatedly. Each problem was real, but each delay cost lives overseas. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, not a single T-26 existed outside of testing grounds. When American armor poured ashore at Normandy, they brought Shermans, thousands of Shermans. They brought bravery, determination, and tactical skill. What they didn't bring was a tank capable of going toe-to-toe with German heavy armor. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy became a slaughter. Panthers positioned in ambush could destroy entire columns before being forced to withdraw. Tiger tanks were treated with superstitious dread. Crews developed dark humor about their chances. The Sherman can be produced in numbers that overcome German tanks. After we lose 4, the 5th one might get them. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, serving with the 3rd Armored Division, would later write about seeing freshly burned out Shermans lined up like a used car lot. The crews hadn't even been removed yet. Some were still inside, carbonized beyond recognition. This was the price of the Army's refusal to prioritize heavy tank development. By late summer 1944, after the breakout from Normandy, the complaints from frontline armor units reached a crescendo that could no longer be ignored. Patton was demanding better tanks. Bradley was demanding better tanks. Even Eisenhower, who had maintained faith in the Sherman, was questioning whether American armor was adequate. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 removed all doubt. German armor, including the new King Tiger, had rampaged through American positions. The Sherman's inadequacy wasn't just a technical problem, it was a strategic crisis. Finally, in January 1945, the order came: get the T-26, now designated the M26 Pershing, to Europe immediately. Not in 6 months, not after more testing. Now. The Pershing represented a fundamental shift in American military philosophy, but that shift came too late and for reasons that reveal uncomfortable truths about military bureaucracy and the cost of doctrinal rigidity. First, consider the doctrine of quantity over quality. American industrial capacity was extraordinary, unmatched in human history at that point. The United States could produce Shermans by the thousands. Factories in Detroit, Grand Rapids, and beyond turned them out in assembly line efficiency that amazed even America's allies. The logic seemed sound. Why build one expensive, complex, heavy tank when you could build 3 or 4 Shermans for the same resources? Overwhelm the enemy with numbers. Accept losses as inevitable. Keep the replacements flowing. This thinking wasn't entirely wrong. German heavy tanks, particularly the Tiger and King Tiger, were mechanical nightmares. They broke down constantly. They consumed fuel at rates that starved other units. They required specialized maintenance and couldn't be easily repaired in the field. A single King Tiger might be worth 3 or 4 Shermans in combat, but it spent half its time broken down or out of fuel. The problem was that American planners failed to account for the human cost of their numerical superiority strategy. Each Sherman that burned took 4 or 5 men with it. Men who had trained together, fought together, relied on each other. Men who knew their tank couldn't penetrate the enemy's armor from the front, who knew that engaging a Panther or Tiger meant probable death, but who went into combat anyway because that was their duty. The doctrine of acceptable losses is only acceptable when viewed from a distance, on a map, in a briefing room far from the burning hulks. The Pershing challenged this calculus. Yes, it was more expensive. Yes, it was more complex. Yes, it took longer to produce. But it could fight German heavy armor on equal terms. It could penetrate Panther armor from the front at combat ranges. It could survive hits that would turn a Sherman into a funeral pyre. For the men inside, that difference was everything. Second, the Pershing embodied the tension between proven reliability and cutting-edge capability. The Sherman, for all its flaws, was reliable. It started when you needed it to start. Its transmission didn't fail after 50 miles. Mechanics could fix it with standard tools and spare parts that were readily available. It could cross bridges that would collapse under a Pershing's weight. It was mechanically sound in ways that early German heavy tanks never were. The Pershing, rushed into production and combat, had problems. Its transmission was adapted from the Sherman and struggled with the increased weight. It was slower than a Sherman, though still faster than German heavy tanks. Its wider tracks and heavier weight limited its mobility in certain terrain. Logistically, it was a nightmare. Different parts, different maintenance requirements, different transport needs. But here's what made the Pershing revolutionary. It was good enough. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't the King Tiger, but it was good enough to kill Panthers and Tigers, good enough to give American tankers a fighting chance, good enough to make German armor commanders think twice before engaging. Sometimes good enough is revolutionary. Third, the Pershing represented a philosophical shift in how America thought about armored warfare. The tank destroyer doctrine, the idea that specialized tank destroyers rather than tanks themselves should fight enemy armor, had dominated American thinking. This doctrine created divided responsibilities, complicated command structures, and put infantry support tanks in situations they weren't designed for. The Pershing said something different. It said that a tank should be able to do everything: support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and yes, destroy enemy tanks. This multi-role concept would dominate American tank design for the next 80 years. The M1 Abrams, the current main battle tank of the United States, is a direct philosophical descendant of the Pershing. When the first Pershings arrived in Europe in February 1945, they went to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions. These weren't random assignments. These were units with combat experience, units that had suffered through the Shermans' inadequacies, units whose commanders understood what they were receiving. The Pershing's 90mm M3 gun was the game changer. Based on anti-aircraft artillery technology, it fired a 17-pound armor-piercing projectile at 2,800 feet per second. The penetration tables told the story. At 1,000 meters, it could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor. A Panther's frontal armor was 80 millimeters. A Tiger's was 100 millimeters. For the first time, American tankers could engage German heavy armor from the front at combat ranges with confidence. The armor protection was equally significant. The Pershing's frontal armor, 102 millimeters at 46 degrees, provided substantially better protection than the Sherman's 51 millimeters. It wasn't impervious. A Tiger's 18mm could still penetrate it under good conditions, but it dramatically increased crew survivability. Hits that would have killed a Sherman crew might leave a Pershing damaged, but intact. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. When you know your tank can kill the enemy before he kills you, when you know your armor might actually stop incoming fire, your entire approach to combat changes. You can be aggressive rather than desperate. You can maneuver rather than just trying to survive. You can fight rather than pray. The famous duel at Cologne demonstrated this perfectly. Sergeant Earley's Pershing engaged and destroyed a Panther from advantageous position, and it was filmed. That footage became propaganda gold, shown to American tankers throughout the front. The message was clear. The playing field had been leveled, but there's a darker solution embedded in the Pershing story, a lesson about institutional reform. The Pershing existed because American tankers died in sufficient numbers that the military bureaucracy could no longer ignore reality. Sometimes institutions only change when the cost of inaction becomes unbearable. The Pershing was built on a foundation of burned Shermans and dead crews. That's a terrible way to drive innovation, but it's often how military institutions work. The Pershing also proposed a logistical solution: accept complexity when it saves lives. Yes, the Pershing required different supply chains. Yes, it complicated maintenance. Yes, it was harder to transport. But these logistical challenges were solvable, and solving them was cheaper than losing 4 tanks for every 1 enemy tank destroyed. The Pershing story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about military decision-making, the value we place on soldiers' lives, and the nature of technological progress in warfare. First, the question of moral responsibility. Who was responsible for the thousands of American tankers who died in Shermans when a better tank could have been built? General McNair, who opposed heavy tank development; the Ordnance Department, which moved too slowly; the War Department, which didn't prioritize the project? Or is this simply the fog of war, the inevitable friction of massive organizations trying to respond to rapidly changing circumstances? There's no comfortable answer. McNair genuinely believed his doctrine would save lives by creating specialized, efficient units. The Ordnance Department faced real technical challenges. The War Department had to balance competing priorities across a global war. But the result was that men died in tanks that their commanders knew were inadequate. At some point, institutional caution becomes institutional culpability. Compare this to German tank development. The Germans went too far in the other direction, building tanks like the King Tiger that were so heavy, so complex and so expensive that they became strategic liabilities. A King Tiger might destroy 10 Shermans, but Germany couldn't replace the King Tiger when it broke down. while America could replace the 10 Shermans in a week. The Germans prioritized battlefield performance over operational reality and paid for it with battlefield paralysis, as their heavy tanks sat immobilized for lack of fuel or spare parts. The Soviet approach provides another contrast. The T-34 was simpler than the Sherman in many ways, but it mounted a more powerful gun and had better armor protection. Soviet commanders accepted the T-34's mechanical roughness, its uncomfortable crew conditions, its tendency to break down, because on the battlefield, it could kill German tanks. The Soviets then upgraded to the T-34-85 when they encountered Tigers and Panthers, giving their medium tank a gun capable of penetrating heavy armor. They prioritized battlefield effectiveness over crew comfort or mechanical refinement. The Pershing landed somewhere between these extremes, more sophisticated than the T-34, more practical than the King Tiger, but still arriving far later than it should have. It represented America learning the lesson that other nations had already absorbed. When your enemy has better armor, you must match or exceed it. Doctrine cannot overcome physics. Bravery cannot overcome engineering. There's also the question of institutional learning. Why didn't the battles of 1943 and early 1944 trigger faster development? The answer reveals how military bureaucracies resist change. There were officers who understood the problem early. There were reports from the front detailing the Sherman's inadequacies. But organizational momentum is powerful. Factories were tooled for Sherman production. Supply chains were built around the Sherman. Training was standardized for the Sherman. Changing course meant admitting error, disrupting production, and accepting short-term weakness for long-term strength. The Pershing succeeded where it appeared not because it was perfect, but because it was necessary, and because by March 1945, even the most resistant bureaucrats could no longer deny that necessity. By the time the Pershing reached combat in meaningful numbers, the war in Europe had just weeks remaining. Most Pershings never fired their guns in anger during World War II. Yet those few dozen tanks that did see combat demonstrated something crucial. American industry could build world-class armor when properly directed. American crews could fight German heavy armor on equal terms when given adequate tools. The technological gap wasn't unbridgeable. It had been bureaucratic, not technical. The M26 Pershing arrived in Europe too late to change the outcome of World War II. Germany was collapsing by March 1945. No tank, however capable, could have substantially altered the war's final months. In that sense, the Pershing was irrelevant to the European theater's conclusion, but in every other sense, the Pershing was profoundly important. It represented American military institutions finally learning the lesson that frontline tankers had been screaming since Normandy. You cannot ask men to fight in inadequate equipment and expect anything but unnecessary deaths. It proved that American engineering could match or exceed any armor in the world when given proper priority and resources. It established design philosophies and operational concepts that would guide American armor development for decades. The Pershing went on to fight in Korea, where it faced T-34-85s and proved highly effective. It evolved into the M46 pattern, then the M47, M48, and M60, a family tree of American tanks that dominated the Cold War. The lessons learned in its rushed development and combat deployment influenced everything from the M1 Abrams to modern defense procurement policy. But perhaps the Pershing's most important legacy is the question it forces us to ask: how many soldiers died because institutions moved too slowly? How many burned Shermans were the price of bureaucratic inertia? How many letters went home to families saying their son, their husband, their father died heroically, when the truth was that he died in an inadequate tank because decision-makers far from the front lines refused to adapt quickly enough? When Sergeant Earley's Pershing destroyed that Panther in Cologne, when that 90mm round turned German armor into a fireball in seconds, it wasn't just a tactical victory. It was vindication for every tanker who had faced German heavy armor in a Sherman and survived. It was justice for those who hadn't survived. It was proof that American troops deserved better than what they'd been given. The Pershing was just a 90mm gun on 46 tons of American steel. But in the rubble-strewn streets of dying Nazi Germany, it was also a promise. Never again would American tankers be sent into battle outgunned and out-armored because bureaucrats couldn't admit their doctrine was wrong. That promise, like the tanks themselves, was imperfect, but it mattered. For the men who climbed into those Pershings, who finally had a tank that could fight on equal terms, who could engage Panthers and Tigers without accepting death as probable, for them, The Pershing wasn't too late. It was salvation.